Well, welcome. Evidently, I'm in charge of this session, and part of me wanted to just sit there for another half hour, Owsley, so thank you for that. That's a great way to start. As Owsley said, I wrote a book called Healing America, and that was coming up, I think, on 10 years ago, and it stemmed from a mindfulness retreat that I went on with John Kabat-Zinn. It was called The Power of Mindfulness. And I had been in politics pretty much most of my adult life after law school. And I went to this retreat in upstate New York and started to learn the practice of mindfulness. It was a retreat where you slowly reduced your talking. There was no journaling. There was no TV. It was just you slowly kind of dropped into silence to where in the last couple of days, it was pretty much a silent retreat. And it just blew the top off my head. Just recognizing, going through Congress, going through back then, those of you who are old enough, the Iraq War. I was on the Veterans Affairs Committee. I was on the Armed Services Committee, so the vets coming back so deeply traumatized from the war. And I started to see these practices as a way to heal veterans in particular, but then also it wasn't a leap to say, you know, how many of our kids in our schools are traumatized from abuse, from violence, from poverty, all of these really important common enemies that we have. And I started to see these contemplative practices as opportunities for us to heal. I took that knowledge and I moved up in my seniority and I got on the Appropriations Committee and I got on a committee that actually funds Congress. It funds the Library of Congress, it funds the Capitol Police, it funds the legislative branch. And I started a House wellness program for members of Congress and staff. And we brought in the different types of healing modalities, including mindfulness and transcendental meditation and other practices to really help the staff heal. And I think that's a pretty good, backdrop for us as we talk about trying to love the stranger. And I think often about the level of trauma that our society has been through, modern society has been through. And if you think back about who makes up the demographics of our society today, the older generation, I mean, we've lost almost all of the World War II generation, which carried its own trauma. But you look at the Vietnam era generation, that many of them started in schools where they had to get under their desks during the Cold War and air raid drills, and then the Vietnam War, the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and Bobby Kennedy and Jack Kennedy, the civil rights movement and all of the trauma involved there, the deindustrialization in most parts of the country in the 1970s and 80s, the boom and bust of our economy, the increased inequality. As a kid watching the space shuttle explode in school, all of these things, and then now you have the older generation who were doing air raid drills, and you have the younger generation that's afraid to go to school because of school shootings. That's our society today. And most recently, the wars that we see, the vets who have come back, that's who we are. And that's why we need to heal. So just to set, one of the things I got into post learning about mindfulness was the book, The Art of War. And there's a concept in The Art of War that says, that talks about meeting people in the ordinary and leading them to the extraordinary. And I learned that the word extraordinary, when it is in Chinese, the definition is the strange. The strange. So as we talk about the stranger today, we need to also see the possibilities that are there, the extraordinary opportunities that we have. And so with that, I want to introduce our first speaker, Rhonda McGee, who I've known for a long time on the mindfulness circuit. As I wrote my book and traveled, I got to meet Rhonda. She has an MA and a JD. She's a professor of law and director of the Center for Contemplative Law and Ethics at the University of San Francisco School of Law. Professor McGee is a mindfulness teacher and a prolific author who has spent more than 20 years exploring the intersections of anti-racist education, social justice, and contemplative practices, garnering international acclaim for her work. She is the author of the award-winning The Inner Work of Racial Justice, Healing Ourselves and Transforming Our Communities Through Mindfulness. Please help me welcome Dr. Rhonda McGee.
Thank you. So I, once again, very honored to be with you all, and so honored by this gracious introduction by my friend, Congressman Ryan, and I'm really honored to be here with my esteemed and beautiful panel of teachers here. And I'm most honored, actually, to be here standing humbly before each of you, because it's no small thing that we take time to come together right now on this theme of loving the stranger. So as was mentioned, my main role in life, my main professional role in life for the last couple of decades has been to serve as a law professor. I studied sociology before. I was focused on how people resolve conflict. And in the course of studying sociology at the University of Virginia, getting a master's degree in that, thinking about the PhD, I was encouraged to really explore the law school as a formal way that people resolve conflict. So this idea of trying to figure out how to resolve conflict more effectively has been a background theme in my life. I found myself, however, limited in a deep engagement with the tools for resolving conflict, actually, despite going to one of these, top law schools and working in San Francisco. For me, it was very clear that there was something more that was needed if we were ever going to more effectively address conflict in our lives. Conflict is endemic. Human beings come together from all of our radically different heritages, backgrounds, experiences, and we enter into contexts that we didn't create, that are interwoven with histories and stories and griefs and losses that are impinging on us, impacting on us as we seek to come together to work together, to learn together, to enact a positive vision through politics and otherwise. And so for me, thinking about the fix we're in as human beings, we are all sharing this beautiful planet. What are we now, 8 billion, right? We are all of us together on this absolutely gorgeous planet that we have been gifted to realize through the power of the visions that have been returned to us from space, is really just this one beautiful, delicate, right, from space, beautiful marble-like, gaseous-like, blue sort of floating dot, bulb, sphere that we're on right now together. Every human being who's ever lived has similarly shared this earth. Our ancestors are here with us in that sense, right? And I mean every ancestor. And that goes back to the ones that we know and the heritages that we know and the groups that we identify with as our people, and then beyond. Humankind has been here hundreds of thousands of years. There is no human history to help us connect the dots all the way back to all of our ancestors. But trust and believe, and the scientists do tell us this much, all human beings who are alive today can trace our ancestry back to a radical commonality that is, the specifics and details of which have been lost to time and history. When I think about the challenge then of resolving conflict and of loving the stranger, I can't help from that long history of reflecting on conflict and the sort of ways in conventional society we try to resolve it through law, through politics. And what was missing that led me to this other modality. I stand here before you wearing what's called a rakasu in the Zen Buddhist tradition. This is a manifestation, an indication that I've taken vows in the Buddhist tradition to walk the path of the Bodhisattva, to address suffering in the world through a sustained and continuous commitment to practice and spiritual growth, and manifesting that as best I can through love and compassion with others. To me, this was the missing piece in all of the high academic training I have, law and sociology, lots of different training in leadership, including, some folks know it, some don't, as a military officer. I was trained and became a lieutenant in the Army. So I have had all the trainings, and what was clearly missing was something that my grandmother Nan knew. Those of you who were with me yesterday know that I grew up in the South, born in North Carolina, and was fortunate to have a grandmother who had entered the ministry. And my grandmother Nan would get up every day with a practice of centering herself. For her, it was centering prayer and devotional study of religious texts, the Bible for her. But what I received from that as a young girl my parents were separating, so I was spending a lot of time with my grandmother at that time. I saw her start every day with this intentionality and this purpose around centering, around remembering who she was in relationship to this great mystery we call life. Well beyond the outer garments, if you will, of skin and bones that, of course, are temporary, and well beyond the particular legacy and history of being a Black woman born in 1906, witnessing the 20th century and all of the terror that was visited upon women like her and limited possibility that was structured in for women like her. Nevertheless, my grandmother found a way to center herself in a sense of possibility and love as the foundation of her life. That was a choice she made. And so, this seemed to me to be an important part of what was missing when I thought and had this opportunity to explore ways of meeting conflict more effectively. And so as I stand here reflecting on this topic of how we might meet and offer love and compassion to the stranger, I can't help from all of those perspectives, especially the spiritual one, especially this deep commitment to a way of continuous practice, aiming at softening my own heart and noticing the impact of my actions in the world and choosing as best I can to meet my own fear, my own anxiety, my own barriers to love with an open willingness to keep learning, to keep dissolving those barriers. It's a way of continuous practice. It's not like a kind of a mindset I arrived at and suddenly it's easy for me. It's about a daily commitment to sort of moving through the world from a view that recognizes that our lives are precious and short. Every single life matters, human and more than human, as we are all, again, radically interconnected with this planet that selected for all of us in a way that is, again, a mystery beyond mysteries. All of us, though, were selected for somehow. Life selected for all of us. So for me, by definition, we all matter. And yet, by definition, as we know, so far anyway, we haven't figured out a way to live forever. So as they say, right, in the traditions, as precious as this all is, none of us get out of this alive. So we have within us, I think, a temptation to great fear about the limited nature of our lives and what we can do, and our inherent vulnerability, or actually radical vulnerability as these soft-bellied beings with such a big brain that we can, sort of convince ourselves sometimes that there's some way we might avoid, reckoning with our radical vulnerability. And so I believe that it's this radical vulnerability that is quietly calling us to consciousness, to reckoning with the bare facts of our existence, the impermanence of it, the fact that as we move through the world in these bodies, in awareness of that impermanence, we can suffer. We can be stuck in those fears. We can, come up with narratives that create the stranger. Because again, as I reflect on all of this, it seems to me, whether I look at children and infants and I look back at my own experiences, we're not born into the world, putting people in hard categories of stranger or not. You look at a baby, whoever feeds that child is their family. I know, I was raised in the South where there was a lot of women like me taking care of babies that didn't look like us, and that was a fraught history and a painful one in many respects. But when I think of my grandmother, Nan's example, she was still cleaning the house of this family called the Outlaws, a white family across town, when I was born and I was a child in the late 60s, early 70s, 1970s, the last century. But my grandmother was cleaning that house, but I remember that on the one hand, that's a structure that says a lot about the way that the old past is not past, right? That history of caste that limited my grandmother to that kind of role was still with us then, and in some ways is still with us now, and yet I'm also here, so everything is impermanent, and everything is subject to some change and possibility, or else I wouldn't be here with you. But seeing my grandmother living in that caste-like situation, nevertheless finding a way to sustain herself in joy and a sense of possibility in her life, inspired me. And yet I can, readily see that that we are always already kind of tempted to find ways to reinforce the sense that we are separate permanently, that things can't change, and that, we've got our already permanent enemies. But what I saw Grandnan do was embrace the connection with the children that she was taking care of for those outlaws. And what also I saw was that they embraced her. It didn't radically change everything, but there was a loving relationship actually there. And so I am not, again, trying to Pollyanna our deep and difficult history around slavery, segregation, and caste in the South. But what I am saying is this idea that we have permanent enemies is perhaps, to me, the stranger in the room. In fact, we're born for connection, and we have been trained for disconnection. And to me, the practices that I've committed my own life to have been about waking up and finding ways to reconnect to the sense that we are already radically interconnected. We are already family. So it's much more about unlearning the training we have against love, because our training against love is pervasive, and we can talk about it today, rather than it being so much about figuring out how to somehow connect with these people that if we just look into each other's eyes right now, if you take a moment to turn around and look into the eyes of someone near you, you can see, have one conversation, you can find commonality, you can see connectedness. And so for me, I look forward to hearing from my beautiful colleagues here, and I thank you for these moments of reflection on how it is that we actually might, not just, find a way to love, but remember the love that's in our hearts, remember the connection that's always already present, that our ancestors, I think, are quietly calling for us to remember at this time. Thank you all so much.
I love her so much. I think we just need to sit for a second with what we just heard. I was taking notes, and the idea of we didn't create this. Some of people that are here didn't create this. How to unlearn. One of the real strategies now with veterans is not to just label them with post-traumatic stress, but to get them into a mindset of post-traumatic growth, and that you had this traumatic experience, and how do you grow from it. So thank you, that was unbelievable, and I can't wait to dig in a little bit more. This is just an amazing panel here. So our next speaker is Rabbi Ben Fried. He's the current rabbi here at Knesset Israel in Louisville. He was ordained at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, where he also earned an MA in Jewish thought through the prestigious Gladstein Fellowship in Entrepreneurial Rabbinic Leadership. Rabbi Fried served in the student rabbi as a student rabbi in Little Rock, Arkansas for 2 years. He was a rabbinic intern at the Conservative Synagogue in Riverdale, New York, and in Jerusalem. He also has completed extensive training in pastoral care through the University of Michigan. As an Ohio guy, I will forgive you for that. University of Michigan Hospitals, and in community organizing through Join for Justice. Prior to rabbinical school, Rabbi Fried earned degrees in journalism and Middle Eastern studies from the University of Texas. He worked as a reporter, yoga instructor, Uber driver, and in the spirit of the gospel panel that we had and the musical stuff we saw last night, where a lot of the folks that were playing at church and singing in the gospel choir and playing in the band in the gospel church on Sunday, they were also playing in bands on Saturday night, having a lot of fun, it sounded like. So Rabbi Fried is also a bar mitzvah DJ, in case anybody needs anything. So please help us welcome Rabbi Ben Fried.
Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you, Tim, and just to echo Rhonda, what an honor it is to be on this panel with these really, really wonderful people who I have already learned from and look forward to continue learning from. Ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha. Not all of you might know what that means, but when I tell you what it does, you'll probably recognize it. From Vayikra, from the book of Leviticus, love your neighbor as yourself. Perhaps one of the most famous lines of the whole Hebrew Bible. And according to one rabbi, Rabbi Akiva, one of our great rabbis in the Jewish tradition, this, he says, is klal gadol b'Torah. This is the most important thing. This is the most important thing you can learn in the Torah. But there are two important critiques of Rabbi Akiva and of this line, love your neighbor as yourself. The first one comes from one of his contemporaries, a rabbi named Ben Azai. Ben Azai says, with all due respect, Rabbi Akiva, you're a big deal, but v'ahavta l'recha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself, that's not the most important line. That's not the most important thing in the Torah. The most important line in the whole Hebrew Bible and the whole Torah is ele toldot ha'adam, is these are the generations of Adam, which comes from, if you're familiar, if you've read the book of Genesis, there are a bunch of these long lists of genealogies. This person begat this person begat that person, and so on and so forth. And one of them is introduced, these are the generations of Adam. It's kind of a shocking pick for the most important thing, right? One of them says, love your neighbor as yourself. The other says, no. It's this beginning of a list of a lot of people who had kids. But the reason is that what Ben Azai is saying is actually the first critique of this line, v'ahavta l'recha kamocha, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, is it relies on the way you feel about yourself for how you feel about others. That ele toldot ha'adam, what this first introduction to a genealogy in the Torah teaches us is, as Rhonda so beautifully said, that we all start from this point of radical sameness. And in my tradition, that radical sameness is that Adam, that the first human, was created b'tselem Elohim, was created in the image of God. And so therefore, if we are all descendants of that same place, if we all go back to that radical beginning, whether or not that's in a secular or religious way, that we recognize that everyone has intrinsic value. That it's not just that I love someone else because I love myself, I love them because they are them, because they are human. Perhaps you believe that's because they're created in the image of God, or perhaps that's simply that they have human worth and dignity as a fellow descendant of our common ancestors. So that's critique number one. Critique number two comes from the Torah itself, from the Bible itself, because it only says once in the whole Torah, "Ve'ahavta l'orecha," and you shall love your neighbor. But there's another line that appears 37 times, and that's the title of our discussion today. Ve'ahavta et hager, and you shall love the stranger. And you shall love that which is not perhaps your neighbor. You shall love those who are perhaps not the exact same as you. Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, Zichrono Livracha, who is the former chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, said that we have to recognize that the Torah tells us over and over again to love the stranger, and only once tells us to love our neighbor. And why might that be? Rabbi Sacks says, because at the end of the day, it might not always be easy to love your neighbor. I don't know what kind of neighbors y'all all have. But it is natural that as human beings, we are tribal people. We generally want to love those who look like us, who think like us, who act like us, who live in proximity to us. That is not so hard. What's really hard, what's really difficult as humans, and not because we're born this way, but as Rhonda said, because we are learned this way, we are taught this way, what can be really hard is to love the stranger. What can be really hard is to love the person who we don't have that natural connection with, who we don't feel as though we are the same as them. And that is precisely why it is repeated over and over again. Because the Torah, the Bible, is a document that recognizes human frailty. It recognizes where we will fall short, and it tells us over and over again, hey, you're not going to want to do this. It's going to feel really hard. It's going to feel unnatural. But it is so, so important. And the injunction to love your neighbor is, not to love your neighbor, to love the stranger is often followed by another line in Hebrew. It's often followed by a line, Ki gerim hayitem be'eretz Mitzrayim, because you yourselves were strangers. That we all have experiences where we have felt othered, where we have felt different, where we have felt like we don't fit in. And we are meant to draw upon those when we look at others and feel that most basic human feeling of empathy, of being able to recognize that why must I love the stranger? Because, as Rabbi Sacks said, the stranger is me. That we have the responsibility to recognize that we have all been in that place and that we must all look out for those who are currently experiencing what it means to be a stranger. It's been a really hard month for me personally. I'm sure it's been a really hard month for many of you. I don't know if any of you have family or friends who are living in Israel or in Gaza or the West Bank. If you do, I hope that they are physically safe. I know that no one who lives in that region right now is emotionally okay. And it's been really hard to think about this line, to love the stranger, when it feels like there is such a lack of empathy for the other, both in the Middle East and, as I've experienced, here in America. I see people who are nominally supporters of Israel saying things like there's no such thing as a civilian in Gaza, and it hurts my heart. I see people ripping down posters of hostages, some as young as 3 years old, who were taken by Hamas and who are being held captive, showing no remorse for humans who simply woke up one day to gunmen in their house pulling them into captivity. And I see a complete lack of love, a complete lack of empathy. I'm not here today to tell you that I think I know what the political or military or other solution is. It's a lot easier to put things on a bumper sticker or in these days on an Instagram panel. But I think that a big problem here is that we have forgotten what it means to love the stranger. We have forgotten what it means to look at someone else, even if they don't look like us, even if they don't dress like us, even if they don't pray like us, and to see a human being. And I believe that that is where we must start. And I don't know where that leads us. And that's scary. Because there are a lot of people, whether they are Israeli, whether they are Palestinians, who are looking at the stranger and they feel or they hear that the stranger does not love them, or in some cases that the stranger wants them dead. And what do we do with that? How do we show that radical love in the face of a lack of love in return? What does that look like? I don't know the answer. I wish I did. It would be nice as a rabbi, as a religious leader, to be able to stand up here and say, I can tell you exactly how to think about this. But in the spirit of radical vulnerability, sometimes we just don't know. But when we just don't know, what we have is the opportunity to return to our morals, to our values, to our teachings, to the teachings of Ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha, to love our neighbor as ourselves, to look out for those who we hold dear, and to the teaching of Ele Toldot B'nei Adam. These are the lines of Adam, recognizing the intrinsic humanity in every person, and the teaching of Ve'ahavta et hager, and you shall love the stranger. Because it is only by returning to these teachings, it is only by returning to these ideas that we can begin in any way to move forward together. I wanted to close by sharing some lines of a poem written by Danny Siegel. If you always assume that the person sitting next to you is the Messiah, waiting for some simple human kindness, you will soon come to weigh your words and watch your hands. And if they so choose not to reveal themselves in your time, it will not matter. May we all learn to see each other, whether we are neighbors or strangers, as humans, as carriers of divine spirit, and as those who we are called upon, who I believe we are obligated to love. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. That was amazing, and I think provides some great jumping off points for our conversation that we're going to have. So thank you, and I know it's been a rough few weeks for you, and I'm sure your family. So thank you for taking time to be with us. Our next speaker is Lyla June. She's an Indigenous musician, scholar, and community organizer of Dine and Tetsis in European lineages. Her dynamic, multi-genre presentation style has engaged audiences across the globe toward personal, collective, and ecological healing. Lyla June blends studies in human ecology at Stanford, graduate work in Indigenous pedagogy, and the traditional worldview she grew up with to inform her music, perspectives, and solutions. She is currently pursuing a doctoral degree with a focus on Indigenous food systems revitalization. Please help me welcome Lyla June.
Greetings, my relatives and my people. So I'm from the Nanisht Ejitachitni clan of the Dine nation. I said, you don't have to succeed, but you do have to try. Dine.
Push both there.
Yes. Dine nation. We are also incorrectly known as Navajo. And I get that clan from my mother. We are a matrilineal people. So we receive our last names from our mothers, not from our fathers. We are indigenous to what is now called New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, and Arizona. But we call it Denebakea, the people's land. And we share it with many beautiful Pueblo nations and our Apache relatives, Nde relatives. And also I just wanted to update, I did finish the PhD. It was a bit of a, we must have sent the old bio over via email. But yeah, no, it's been a good journey. And I just want to say how much I love you all and how happy I am to be here and how happy I am to the Creator for giving us life this morning. I love this topic of loving the stranger because a lot of my life has been dedicated to trying to figure out how to do that. As an Indigenous woman, you can imagine what it's like to wake up every day in this country, in this place that destroyed 98% of my people. And because we were strange to them, and because we were standing on land they wanted, right? So not only why didn't they love us as strangers, but how can I love them as strangers? How can you love someone after abuse has occurred? And some people call that grace. Some people call that forgiveness. And I've really enjoyed diving into that in my life. But loving the stranger, let's make no mistake, it takes courage. It takes bravery. It takes the ability to lean into discomfort. And it takes compassion. And so I'm going to invite us all to try to do that today. Albert Einstein said, our job is to extend our circle of compassion wider and wider and wider to envelop the whole universe. So how can we do that? How can I, as a Native woman growing up, I grew up in Taos, New Mexico, where people were actually very supportive of my culture. So I also know what it means for the other to celebrate me, to celebrate who I was. And whether they were Native or non-Native, they respected Diné people, and they respected our language, and they still do. So I've tasted the fruits of what happens when we do love the stranger, and it is beautiful. But I speak to you at a time where my heart is broken, deeply broken, for what is occurring in the world today. And I think part of our job today is to expand our compassion to everyone, even those the media tells us to hate, even the ones the media tells us it's okay to murder, even the ones who we are taught is unimportant because they murdered us. And so I think it's so important to draw these parallels. So I'd like to tell you a quick story. Back in the day, Indigenous peoples here in what I call Turtle Island. I try not to call it America because America comes from Amerigo Vespucci. Amerigo Vespucci was documented to be commissioned to find people to enslave and gold to extract. So we don't really like to name this land after him because this land does not stand for enslavement and extraction. It's this land stands for liberation and abundance and giving and being a warrior for your people, being a warrior for others. So Turtle Island is our word for this land. But hundreds of years ago, this place was quite bad for Native people, and it still is today. But we were being sieged, and we were being exterminated. And in California, it was even funded to exterminate us. You could get $5 for every scalp you brought to Sacramento of a Native American. And so during this time, ironically, we were called the savages. We were called the terrorists. And it was so painful for our ancestors. And also, there was so much of us trying to be harmed, and yet we were expected to be perfectly peaceful when they were slaughtering us by the millions. And you know what? Sometimes we succeeded in that. And it was beautiful when we did. And sometimes we did not. But I say this today because I feel a similar story unfolding in Gaza, in what we call the Gaza Strip. And right now, a terrible, terrible attack happened, right? October 7th by Hamas. They estimate about 1,200 people were killed brutally. And that's terrible. And today, as I stand here, 12,000 people have died that we know of in Gaza, and almost half of them are children. And what's crazy, and why I must say something today, and why I must invite us to lean into this challenge to love the stranger, is that our tax dollars are funding the Israeli army. Last year, we gave $400 million a day to Israel. And at this time, they are raining bombs over half of the residential structures, 200,000 residential structures have been obliterated. And so I cannot remain silent today on this. We are funding the active cleansing of a people as we speak, our tax dollars. And so if I ask myself, if I was born in the year 1800 and the US was sieging these people because they felt this manifest destiny, they felt that they were divinely ordained to take the land from sea to shining sea, what would I say in the 1800s? What would I want others to say? Even if it was unpopular, even if it was scary, to love these strange Native Americans who dress different, talk different, what would I have wanted people to say? I would have wanted them to say, hey, stop it. Stop killing these people. They're not animals. They're beautiful. And so similarly, I must say this today, because we're in 2023 now, and something very similar is unfolding in our lifetimes, where they are actively trying to destroy a people. I do not care if the president of Hamas is under a hospital. That still would not give us the right to bomb a hospital. And hospitals are being bombed right now in Gaza, killing hundreds of people at a time. And we have seen all the bloodied children, thousands of them. And don't get me wrong, there's children dying all over the world right now, in many different places. But this one is unique to us as Americans, because we are funding this. We are funding these things. And so I humbly as I possibly can, I urge us all to act now, because we've been trained not only to not love the stranger, but to actively not care for the stranger at all. And so at this time in our media, everything is slanted. Everything is slanted. And so it's very hard for us to love the stranger today, especially in Gaza, because all of this information is muffled. And so how are we going to love the stranger when so many things are working to divide us apart? And so as part of our strength and our courage to expand our field of compassion to every child, and this goes for pro-Palestinians as well, we must expand our compassion to every single Israeli person, every single beautiful Jewish person who has suffered immense trauma over the centuries, and who are creators, people who were here to help bring people closer to the Creator. And although some of them lost their way, many of them did not. We must also, as pro-Palestinians, expand our realm of compassion, even to the ones who harm us, even to the ones we don't understand. And only then will that bridge be made. And so it's a hard job to love the stranger. I think we could easily take the route of making this a nice, pretty, flowery panel. But the truth is, it's hard. And I know I'm out of time, so I'm just going to end with one final story. We have this figure in history called Jesus. And Jesus was an expert at loving the stranger. Jesus was radical. Jesus was a very different person than most of us often think of. When Jesus was, he didn't take sides. He sat and had dinner with the tax takers. He sat and had dinner with prostitutes who were more like slaves. He had dinner with he sat with the woman at the well, who was not the right culture to be loved or cared for. And he always cared for the lepers, and no matter, or people with leprosy, I should say. And he was an expert at being brave, right? When everyone was stoning this woman because she had sinned, he easily could have remained quiet and said nothing, lest he be stoned as well. But no, he stood up and he said, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone." And he was an expert at being so brave to those who stepped to him and said, "What? These people aren't paying taxes. Isn't that terrible?" And he said, "Well, what's on the coins?" And it says, "Caesar." Well, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's. And so there's many of these figures throughout time, right, that we admire. And those people are the people who loved in the face of extreme fear, who loved their enemy, who loved the people that the world trained them to hate. And I'm begging you, please, let's put that down, because lives are in the balance as we speak. And we must break free from the silos we've been put in, the information silos, and we must betray, we must betray our peers who pressure us to only love one group, because that is not what the Creator would want for us. So I'm going to finish now, but I'm just going to end by saying that I could not remain silent today when children are being ripped apart by our own tax dollars. And I would beg you, please, please consider, if you're not already in the know, please consider standing up for the children who are dying as we speak, funded by our tax dollars. Thank you.
Thank you, Lyla. What an amazing time to have this conversation and to have this conference, because there is so much suffering. And I hope, I can only hope and pray, as many of you could, that we have this kind of conversation going on in the capitals around the world to help bring this to a close. I think there was a common theme from all of our speakers here about forgetting, like forgetting our history, forgetting our lineages. And as a practical government guy, I've always tried to think, okay, I know about some of these practices. How do we get it out of the silos? How do we get it out of the conferences that we go to and the speeches that we give? How do we get it out? So I would just like to pose, and Rhonda, we can start with you, like, how do we remember?
How do we remember?
How do we remember?
Oh, the musical pause.
A musical pause.
That is a perfect question to have teed up.
Yes,
Thank you, Owsley.
as we pause.
I think our wonderful musical offering is going to come from the back. His name is Ben Soli,
Ben Soli, local hero.
All right, thank you.
Hi, Ben.
I couldn't quite hear. Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah.
I didn't know what I was doing, so we're.
Thank you, brother.
Just one microphone is good. Just that short one's good.
All right. Thank you, brother.
Ben Lee. I'm a cellist here in Louisville, Kentucky, and I'm so grateful for this gathering, this time together. I just tuned my cello because that's one of the most important things to do for everyone. You got to get yourself in tune if you expect to make any harmony.
Thank you so much.
Excellent job. So Owsley, can I ask you real quick, do we have 20 minutes, or are we using the whole 20, or?
Yes.
Follow the clock.
Okay, we have 20.
Very good. My congressman, I need a lot of help in figuring out the blow-by-blows here. Thank you. So as I listen to all of you speak, as I said, the question of how do we remember, and maybe I should make it just a slightly more pointed on, because when we have these inflection points like we have now, we all know the brain research of being in fight or flight mode and not being able to engage your prefrontal cortex and your reasoning skills and all of that goes away. So my question really is, with all of your various experiences, how do we institutionalize remembering?
Yes, yes.
If that makes any sense.
Absolutely. So those of you who were with me yesterday will find no surprise in what I'm about to say. For me, and I've mentioned it already today in some respects, it is about committing to doing that. I believe in recognizing the power that we all have to make a difference, and recognizing that our lives are precious and short. For most of us, we have no idea whether we're going to live out the rest of this day even. So when you combine the preciousness and the limited nature of it, and you recognize we're all suffering in some way, then that invitation to choose how you want to live is a real one, and it's a daily one. And so if you see that invitation to choose how you want to live, and really recognize that remembering is not easy, and caring for people who look different is hard, then to me, making intentional a commitment to remember is the first step. Get your neocortex in line, like with, okay, I'm gonna practice remembering. And then, as you pointed out, it's hard for us neurobiologically to remember to do something that goes against our deep training and that can invoke, fear and trepidation, the fight or flight dynamics that we know are natural to our biology. So we need to balance that out with practices that help us feel joy and connection. This is why we sang. This is why, the gospel music session last night resonated so deeply with many of us. Singing the NIH, where I'm privileged to also be affiliated as a member of the advisory committee on the National Institutes for Integrated Health and Care, we know that the scientists are telling us how important movement, song, dance can be to help counterbalance, disrupt the fight and flight. So last night we sang literally a song I created to help us remember. Remember love, remember the sun, remember the family, remember we are one, remember, right? And so it's simple things, singing together, creating spaces where we can connect, making it a practice to wake up and pause and recognize this beautiful planet that we're in. If it's a little window, go to a window. But making these kinds of things a part of our regular practice is, I think, a really important first step.
Nice. Rabbi, you're obviously in a synagogue,
Yes.
So you have
We do a lot of institutional and communal memory as Jews, and I have to share, Lyla, while I really appreciate, Lyla? I want to make sure I pronounce her name right.
Lyla.
Lyla. As a Jewish person whose, whole culture is built around memory, you're, in the spirit of radical vulnerability, your framing of the conflict was really hurtful to me. That the framing of the conflict as an indigenous people fighting against the American colonialist with manifest destiny, I, every single year on Passover, say next year in Jerusalem. At every Jewish wedding, we break a glass to remember the destruction of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. The framing of the Jews as a people who had no actual connection to the land, but were simply there because of some manifest destiny that they kind of believed was something, to me, felt really hurtful. And while I, again, appreciate Americans, we should stand up and tell our representatives how we think our tax dollars should be spent. And it is an absolutely reasonable and ethical position that they should not be spent in this way and militarily. The framing of this conflict as a people with connection to the land versus a people with no connection to the land, to me was hurtful precisely because of memory. And that memory is deep, and that memory is not just about what we ourselves remember, but it's what our people remember. It's what we remember in our bones. And as Jews, we have generational trauma. And as Palestinians, there is also generational trauma. And that doesn't mean that one person's generational trauma is better or worse or more valid or less valid than others. But to discount one of those in favor of the other, to me, felt really difficult to hear. And the Jews who are now living in Israel are descendants of people who were kicked out of their homes in Europe, who were kicked out of their homes in Iraq, in Morocco, in Iraq, in Iran, in all of these countries that said, we don't want you. And they went to this land. And maybe they do things there that we don't want them to, or you don't want them to, or I'm not proud of, or all of those things. But to frame this as a people who went to try to conquer, who went to try to take over land with which they had no connection, to me is really painful and really harmful. And I think that doesn't mean that we can't, again, as you said, expand the circle for whom we care about. And I think that people who are Jewish and all people who have connection to that land need to be able to expand our compassion and expand our empathy and be able to identify with those who are dying, because no one deserves that. And unless we lean into our memory, unless we lean into our communal remembrance of what happens, I think that we come out with a paucity of understanding and a paucity of ability to empathize if we discount the memory and the institutional and lived generational history of the other.
Thank you very, very much for sharing that. And I agree that clearly your ancestors are indigenous to that land, and that is something I want to honor. I think the only parallel between the Manifest Destiny was that America felt as though it was their divine right to conquer a people. And I think there's a notion that God has ordained that. I'm not saying you think this, I know you don't, but some people think God has ordained people to wipe out a people and overcome a land. So that's the only parallel. So I really appreciate you sharing that. And I watched a brief interview with a woman, and they said, what would you tell a Palestinian child who, wants to live where they were born and all that? And she said, and again, not saying this is a universal perspective, it's just one perspective. She said that God has ordained us to be here, so it doesn't matter what you want as a child, you can't stop what God is going to create. And I think that's the only parallel between Manifest Destiny, is that America essentially said, they were standing in Washington, D.C., and they were looking at San Francisco, and they were saying, all right, sorry, Native people, God has already ordained that we're going to take this whole thing over, so you can't really argue with God. And obviously, the Creator, whom we all on this panel know and love, is about love. And so that's all I wanted to say is when I was, and I appreciate you telling me that, and I want to say I'm sorry for the pain that it caused. And that I am deeply appreciative of you and your people and your lineages. I was just standing with a large group of beautiful Jewish brothers and sisters in a March for Palestine recently. So I know it's not about religion in any way, shape, or form. It's about what is wrong and right. And I think we all agree here that no matter where the child is from, Israel or Palestine, they deserve a life. And they deserve safety. And so I just want to thank you for saying that.
You all touched upon one way or the other, leaning in on the conflict, leaning in, being vulnerable, being brave. And I just want to thank both of you for being very, very brave to have this conversation in a very, very public setting. I assume that the genesis of this very conference is how do we have these very difficult conversations in a way that we could potentially start to resolve it or restructure our society in a way that we prevent this from happening because we did the groundwork. And that's kind of what I was getting to with, I look back and we see every day in the paper, you know, a society that our institutions have decayed, they've rotted, they don't train us to see the world in this way. And you know, my hope is that we use these very traumatic experiences to say we don't want to do this anymore. You know, whether it's institutional poverty or what's happening on our reservations or what's happening in the Middle East, like the school shootings, I think there's a collective exhaustion in the country that we don't want to keep doing this. And I think it's really important too that we see these young people here because, you know, quite frankly, we need you to engage in the kind of conversations that you're hearing up on the stage. And I hope that Lyla and Ben have modeled for you on how to handle this kind of conflict, because it is difficult and it does take bravery to encourage to do it in the way they did. And so I consider this already, you know, a success. The key too is the turning, and Joseph Campbell talked about this in his very often, turning thous into its. How do we turn thous into its so that we can be in a position, or people think they can be in a position to slaughter, to murder, that it's okay because they're not divinity, they're not people that we are connected with. And so again, I think it's important how we think about the institutions. How do we have institutions in our schools, in our churches, in our synagogues, and create an environment where we can actually instill this viewpoint. And I'm just open for ideas. I think, and those of you who are on the front lines of this, I would love to hear any thoughts that you may have on how we could take the conversation that we're having here and actually try to embed it into our current institutions. Yeah.
Well,
and you were in the military. And
I was in the military. I'm a law professor, and for the past 20 plus years at my law school, I've been bringing opportunities for practicing meditation and also just, you know, creating a space for cultivating awareness, for cultivating compassion, for centering on our values, for bringing more intentionality into how we take the knowledge, skills, and values that are traditional to teaching law into the world in ways that can maximize our ability to really find common ground. When I went to law school, we weren't creating spaces where you could figure out, all right, how is it that I can stay in touch with my heart, even as I take, you know, this new set of skills I've picked up as a lawyer into the world. We weren't given courses and seminars where we could do that. I'm part of a network of folks who have been doing that at different law schools. And as a consequence, next week I'll go back to school and hold a space for conversations about this very issue. And this is something that is being done in our institutions these days in ways that wasn't being done, you know, decades ago. So that's something to celebrate, actually. Change is happening around us. There is more receptivity to actually being intentional about how do we resolve conflict. Conflict is endemic. It's not a sign of failure that you have a difference of opinion. We have very different backgrounds and different ways of approaching the challenges of our time. So how to, you know, find common ground, turn together to face something that we would like to see dealt with differently, as opposed to constantly reinforcing the notion of an adversarial us versus them mentality. Those, you know, bringing about transformative justice, restorative justice, different approaches is what I think is happening and what we need to like look for, celebrate, amplify, shine the light on, because this is where I think the future is demanding that we go, in the direction of finding ways to reconnect with our common humanity, and from that place, put ourselves together on the same side of our conflicts, as opposed to constantly polarizing each other at the first sign of a dispute.
Rabbi, I'd be interested, because we see protests, and I had friends that were at the DNC the other night and got escorted out, and you have bomb squads and cops, and it just spins out of control.
Yeah.
Can you share with us some of your thoughts on that?
So we have a concept in Judaism called machloket l'shem shamayim, which means an argument for the sake of heaven. And it teaches us in the Talmud some of the ways to do that. And I think it starts out with seeing the other, the stranger, as a person, not seeing someone who might think differently than you as inherently evil. It says that the rabbis who had machloket l'shem shamayim, that they still ate in each other's houses, they still sat down and had meals together. They were able to be together in community, even with people with whom they strenuously disagreed. And I think that we've lost that ability. I think as soon as we see someone on, and not to harp on social media, but you see someone on Twitter who you disagree with, you either unfollow or you clap back, or there's not really a desire to have a dialogue, to have anything in which you are listening. You just want to be right. And I think that there's a focus of so many of us of wanting to be right and wanting to be seen as being right, and that we get social clout or social standing by being right, by standing with the right thing, and that divides everything into a binary of right and wrong. And so then if the person isn't right, then they are wrong. And so when you say, I'm not really sure, or I think there might be a gray area, or it seems really hard to, then you're wrong because you're not right. And I think that breaking down some of those, and I think that a lot I have folks who work in the buildings that are being protested, and I have friends who are folks doing the protesting. And I think that right now, a big part of they're not talking to each other. And that's a big part of the problem. And that it takes a lot of bandwidth, and it takes a lot of empathy, and it takes a lot of, it takes your own spiritual and personal capital to be willing to do that listening. And we also have to recognize that when people are dying, when bombs are falling, when people are being held hostage, people have a lower threshold for all of that. And so how do we deal with this right in this moment? And then how do we build for the tomorrow that we all, I think, hope for, when we are past this moment of acute conflict, and we move into, in this conflict, there's acute conflict, and then there's kind of low-level simmering conflict, and how do we actually move towards resolution? And I think the one thread of hope that I'm holding on to is, if you had told someone in November of 1973 that by the end of the decade there would be peace between Egypt and Israel, they would have laughed in your face. If you told someone in 1945 that the Brandenburg Gate in Germany would be lit up with the colors of the Israeli flag in support of a Jewish state, they would have said you were out of your mind. And so there have been times throughout history when we think that there is absolutely no way forward between peoples, that we have found that way forward. And so my hope and my prayer is that we too, even when it feels like there is no way forward right now, that we will have leadership. And leadership has been complete and utter failure on all sides in this conflict, and I will not pretend to think otherwise. But when we have better leadership that can move us forward, that I'm hopeful that we will be able to get somewhere towards some sort of listening.
So there's a lack of hope, and I think, Lyla, maybe you could share kind of in closing here. You seem to maintain some level of hope.
Oh, yeah.
So how do you?
How do I do that? Well, hope. I mean, I often think to myself, peace is not only possible, but it's unstoppable. We may not see it in our lifetimes, but if you look throughout history, all of the civilizations that hang their hat on domination and oppression of others, they always fall. And the Creator always humbles them. If you look at my ancestors, we had the Chaco Canyon. We had a big city where we find parrot feathers from South America, or rather Central America, copper from Wisconsin, chocolate, right there in New Mexico, which now doesn't seem like a very interesting place to the world. They're often like, oh, you're from Mexico? Like, no, it's the newer one. Yeah, this was a huge city. This was a huge, bustling city before Columbus was ever born. And we had, unfortunately, we went the wrong way. And we started a caste system. We started to enslave each other. And we started to also enslave the earth to some extent. And around the year 1100, the Creator sent us a drought as a gift to give us the courage to change. And so the Creator is always helping us. The Creator is always, these things might look like punishments, but they're not. They are support systems to humble us and remind us we are not God. And so I think my hope comes from the fact that all of these cities that rise up in this false notion of hierarchy, whatever type of hierarchy it is, white supremacy, male supremacy, human supremacy, whatever it is, they always fall. And not fall in a bad way, though, but fall in a way where we learn. And so I think even this extremely difficult time now of mass extinction, of war, of division, of what they call the polycrisis, right? This convergence of crises, that this will be, as tragic as it is, and it will be an extreme learning moment for humanity, of that time when we realized, we learned the hard way, right? Like, oh, that didn't work. That didn't work to see each other as other. That didn't work to have, any race be above another. That didn't work to think that plants and animals and fungi and birds were less important than humans. That we have all these PhDs, but so much poverty. We have all these rocket scientists, but we have so much war. And when we realize that, that only led us to a precipice of global collapse. And so that type of learning, you can only learn by hitting the dust, And so to see these times as our gift of, you touch that stove, it's gonna burn you. But after you touch that stove, you heal. After you touch that stove, you learn, right? Don't touch that stove. And so I think, believe it or not, I think this earth is designed to self-regulate. And I think this earth is designed to bring us back on course. And as they say, the proof is in the pudding. So if America rises and falls in less than 300 years, that system wasn't really working, right? I'm not saying we're falling completely, but I'm saying our ecosystem is, for sure. And so that didn't work, right? So if you look at it from a more longitudinal perspective, that we are in the middle of forever, that, as John Trudell says, then we are actually only ever going to refine ourselves, evolve ourselves, and get better and better and better as people. And that's our job now, to take these big brains and opposable thumbs and not use them to dominate, but see that these are tools to give us the ability to care for life on Earth. And that's what we're here to do. It's like they said in Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility, right? So this is not for us to be kings and queens of the world. This is for us to be servants of the earth and use what we have to give and to care for all life. So anyways, I'm out of time once again, but thank you.
Let me just say, we have covered a lot of territory, from deep quotes in the Torah to Spider-Man movies. But many times you come to these conferences and you hear speakers and panelists talk. But I just want to ask you to help me thank these panelists for actually embodying the vulnerability, the bravery, and the courage to have such a great panel. So thank you.
And I just wanted to point out as we conclude this probably life-changing session that we've just had is to remind many of the students that joined us here today that you have friends that are Muslim, you have friends that are Jewish in your midst, you have friends that are heartbroken, that are from other traditions with you. And perhaps in this modeling that you saw today, there's an example of how we can be together, bear witness in the suffering together, and find ways to expand our compassion around this time in our lives. And so I want to end with a teaching that we were given by 2 high school students from the Buddha Blessed Temple on Thursday, when they described their greeting at the end, their greeting for each other. They say, we have one hand that brings forth our common humanity and reminds us of what is divine in each and every one of us. We have one hand that reminds us of our common humanity, the things that we're not quite as proud about in our human existence and the things that we do to each other. We bring them together because love incorporates all of it. And we bow to the divinity in each other. So I just thought that was a lovely example taught by high school students to a bunch of adults. This is complicated, and I just think what you all did for us today was a tremendous gift in helping us navigate this really difficult time. So we will end as we typically do with our 1 minute of silence, and then please join the Embodying Love Plaza out in the main lobby.